Hello and welcome to the program. We're joined by Anne Applebaum, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. Her recent book, Red Famine, Stalin's War in Ukraine, covers the Holodomor, the artificial famine imposed by Soviet leader Josef Stalin. And we'll be discussing how it impacted Ukraine's history as well as the modern society and world history in general. Thank you so much for joining me. In your book, you've written that nearly 4 million Ukrainians were starved, died as a result of this man-made famine. How do you think what kind of an impact do you think it's had on modern Ukrainian society?
So this is a very long question, which I talk about in the book at more length, but I think the important thing to remember is the famine was both an attack on the peasantry and that it weakened the ties between people, it weakened village communities and so on in the countryside, but it was also simultaneously, alongside the famine, there was an attack on the Ukrainian intellectual and political elite that took place immediately afterwards, and the arrests of artists and writers and historians and even the Ukrainian Communist Party. And the people who replaced them, both in the city and at the village level, who replaced the leaders, were people who were much more cowardly, who were much more afraid, cowardly is the wrong word actually, I mean I think they were simply afraid. And you lost really a generation of leadership, of patriots, of people who were loyal to the country, and they were replaced instead by people who didn't have that kind of respect. And I think the long-term legacy is that many Ukrainians became suspicious of the state. The state was seen as a foreign body, something that was dangerous. You better stay away from the state and its institutions and not be influenced by them, not touch them. And this kind of feeling that the state and people who are in power are different from us, they act in their own interests, they aren't representatives of us. I think this is a problem not only in Ukraine actually, but in the whole post-Soviet world even today. And the idea, of course, of a state which is, in which people who work for it are patriots, and in which we expect things from them, and they expect from us participation, and in which they are, it's not a foreign body, it's ours. This is something that's new, and it hasn't quite caught hold in Ukraine.
Right, and in your book as well, you touched down on Ukraine trying to kind of lobbying for the UN to recognize the famine as genocide. You touch upon that topic, and it's largely debated whether to call it. Recently, a number of MPs in British Parliament, they called on the government to recognize it as genocide, and more than 17 other countries already do. Do you think that this is a very important acknowledgement, legally speaking and morally speaking?
So I think, yes, it's important that the Ukrainian famine be recognized as genocide. I've said that many times, and although there are some problems with doing that in international law, I think actually if you worked country by country, you would discover that people in a lot of places are sympathetic to that. I don't think for Ukraine it should be the center of your foreign policy or your attempt to establish yourself on the world stage. I think you would do that better by making an argument about the kind of country you are, what you want to become, the achievements that you've had since 2014, and where you want to go farther. I think Ukraine should be striving to play a positive role internationally, and that it's not your history that will gain you respect. It's who you are now.
It's what Ukraine aims to achieve in the
and what it is. People will read the history of Ukraine if they're interested in Ukraine, and they will be interested in Ukraine if Ukraine is prosperous and they want to do business here, or if it's culturally interesting and they want to read Ukrainian books or see Ukrainian films, and then they'll become interested in the genocide. It doesn't work the other way around.
Right. And recently I read some of the kind of comments underneath a book review of Red Famine, Stalin's War in Ukraine. And if we take apart kind of all the comments that were written by Russian trolls, obviously there's more than 100, I had the impression that a lot of them were questioning and were still debating whether this was Stalin's kind of main goal to eliminate the Ukrainian population.
Oh, sure. So this is a legitimate historical argument, actually. I mean, so let's be clear, this is not Russian trolls. I mean, so the question is, there was a famine all over the Soviet Union in 1932 and 1933. And a lot of people died in Russia, and they died in other parts of the USSR. There was a particularly bad famine in Kazakhstan, for example, which had other causes. And the argument of my book is that within that general famine, within that chaos caused by chaos and the disastrous decisions around collectivization, within that, Stalin used that moment to get rid of a problem in Ukraine, and the problem was one of the rebellious Ukrainian peasantry and of the Ukrainian political class. So there is a legitimate historical argument to be had about whether or not what Stalin did was intentional. In other words, was he trying to kill people, or was it just kind of an accident? And my argument is that he was trying to kill people, and that there's a reason why the famine was worse in Ukraine in the spring of 1933 than it was in other places, and that was because of decisions that he took a few months earlier.
Was it to stamp out this nationalist sentiment that a lot of historians say?
So one of the things I found when working on the book was that in 1932, when Stalin is considering what to do about the famine, which is already then beginning to spread, he begins speaking and writing quite a lot about the Civil War. And he starts talking about 1918, and he starts talking about, he says these are all Petlurites, he starts seeing agents of Pilsudski. And my argument is that this is because he sees Ukraine as this continuous problem. Ukraine is a problem. It challenges the legitimacy of Bolshevism. It opposes the Soviet regime. It could even be dangerous for the Soviet regime, and so therefore we need to get rid of this problem. And that he therefore uses the famine in the winter and spring of 1933 to eliminate this Ukrainian problem. And that's the book's argument. But sure, there is a legitimate argument that says it was an accident, and there are people who've made that argument before. But I think I have assembled the archives in the evidence in such a way that proves it was intentional.
So do you think that he targeted a specific part of the population?
So my argument is that he particularly targeted peasants in Ukraine because he was afraid of another peasant rebellion. There had been a peasant rebellion in 1918 and 19, which he remembered very well and which had been very dangerous for the Bolsheviks at the time. There had been another major peasant rebellion in 1930, which is also a topic of the book. And in 1932, when he saw that when this starvation is spreading, he makes a series of decisions that make the famine worse in Ukraine. And this is to undermine the peasantry and to eliminate this possibility of rebellion happening again.
Right. And do you think that the Ukrainian government, since gaining independence, do you think that how they handled that part of the country's history has been? Do you think it's been fair? Do you think that Ukraine needs to do more in order to focus on that part of its history?
So you would have to tell me whether that's true. I mean, the degree to which Ukraine has successfully explained its history to young Ukrainians, I don't know. I mean, you would have to tell me. And I mean, I would make a different point, which is that I think the most important thing that Ukraine could do as a monument to the famine and as a way to memorialize the victims would be to create a country where nothing like that can ever happen again. And that means to create a country that has strong institutions, that has a neutral and honest state, that has independent courts, that has a strong independent media, and that has well-educated citizens who participate in democracy. And that would be really the best recipe against it happening again, and that would be the best memorial you could create to the victims of the famine.
And the best recipe for Ukraine's war that's going on right now in the East, and a general kind of recipe.
So again, this so of course to win this war, you need an army. You need to think about defense strategy and so on. But once again, this is a war which is not just a military war. It's also an information war. It's also a political conflict. And having a Ukrainian state which Ukrainians feel loyal to and which they admire and care about, this is really your best defense against Russian propaganda.
I see. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
You're watching UATV.